Hi guys, I'm just recording a video for anyone who was hoping to come to the first Christianity Explored um, youth evening on Thursday night and wasn't able to make it. We'd love to see you again this coming Thursday, but I thought I'd just let you know what we've done so far so that you can think about it and decide if it's something that you're interested in, and then you'd be ready to come if you are. What we're really doing is we're going through John's Gospel, one of the four accounts of Jesus' life and death and resurrection in the Bible. It's written by one of Jesus' disciples, John, so it's an eyewitness account, and we're just going to be looking through it together over, we've just done 1 week, and over the next 2 Thursdays. And we started by looking at John chapter 1, the very first part of John's Gospel. There's a handout attached to in the comments on the video, if you want to print that off and have it in front of you. And I won't read it out now, but you'll probably want to read it through yourself. So if you pause the video and read it through, then and then come back. So I just wanted to make a few comments about what we looked at on the first evening from chapter 1. And I'm going to start just by reading the very end of the section on the handout, which is verse number, that's the small numbers on the page, verse number 18. If you look at the start of verse 18, it says, "No one has ever seen God." No one has ever seen God. The Bible is a very realistic book. It doesn't make pretenses. And there it says it, no one has ever seen God. In a sense, it's religion's biggest problem. Despite all the priests and ceremonies and festivals and rules and religious clothing and artwork, music, theology, courses, buildings, shrines and teachings, no one's actually seen God. It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's a bit of an embarrassment for religion, but there it is. The Bible's honest. No one has ever seen God. And so if you look back to verse 5, it describes a world in darkness. The light shines in the darkness. We haven't seen God, so we're in the dark about the very thing that matters most. Is there a God? We can't see him. Is there a God? If there is, what's he like? What does he think of me? Is he interested? Those kind of questions. But we're in complete darkness. And light and dark in John can refer to goodness, a bit kind of Star Wars, that there's the light and then there's the dark. So in chapter 3, it means that. But actually, in chapter 8 and chapter 12, if you look, darkness has to do with just not knowing things, not understanding the world we live in, not knowing if there's a God, not knowing if there's life beyond this one, that we're in darkness, that we're stumbling around. In John chapter 12, Jesus describes a world that's in darkness, where we just don't know where we're going. I guess there's sort of 3 big categories of darkness where we just don't know about the really big stuff. We started Thursday night by saying, if you could get all the world together onto one Zoom meeting and decide on the one question that most of us want to know the answer to, what would it be? And we had various really good suggestions as to what it might be. I guess there's 3 big areas where we'd love to know some answers and often feel like we're in real darkness. Some of them are to do with ourselves. I feel in darkness, a lack of understanding about what I'm like and why I'm like what I'm like. Why can I be kind a lot of the time and then just suddenly from nowhere I say something really unkind, something so cruel? Why is it so hard to find happiness? Why does it seem that we're able to chase after things like sex and relationships and fun and drink and drugs and sporting achievement and popularity and still wake up wondering why we feel empty? Why are we like that? So questions about me, questions about life as well. Why are we here at all? Is there life after death? Or do we just die and rot? Questions about life. And then questions about God. Is he there? What's he like? What does he think of me? Will I meet him one day? If I do, what will be the look on his face when he sees me? Will we meet as friends or enemies? And John says here straight away that by nature, no one can know God. By nature, we're all in the darkness. And if we're going to get to know him, we need him to introduce himself to us personally. On our first Thursday evening, we had a bit of a fun experiment where we all tried to work out how we would get to meet the Queen if we were going to try and sort of break into Buckingham Palace, which we're not. But how would we go about doing that? And people came up with all these ideas, dressing up as guards, flying light aircraft in. But all of them are desperate attempts to do something that we can't really do. If we're going to get to know the Queen, she's going to have to decide that she wants to get to know us. She'll have to leave the palace. She'll have to introduce herself to us. Now, if that's true with the Queen of the country, how much more is that true of the God of the universe, if there is one? That if we're going to get to know him and not be in the darkness, he's going to have to step out and introduce himself. So back to our question, how can we know anything about God? Well, no one has ever seen God. We're in the darkness. By nature, no one can know God at all. But also, we looked at the fact that, amazingly, God has kind of left his palace. Just like the Queen coming out through the gates of Buckingham Palace and saying, I'm here. Well, God has done that. So even though by nature no one can know God, through Jesus, God can be known. Just look at verse 18 again. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. If you look back at verse 1, we find out a little bit more about this person who has made God the Father known. The strange thing in verse 18 is that he's God, the one and only. He's the only God, but he also seems to be with God. He's at the Father's side. That seems a bit strange. You get the same thing back in verse 1. They're kind of like bookends to this section. It's the same slightly strange paradox. In the beginning was the Word, and here it is. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He seems to be distinct from God, and yet God. He's with God, but he was God. Verse 1 and verse 18 have the same kind of thing. But verse 18 adds something. God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. No one's ever seen God until now. But now God has been made known through this person who was with God but was God. And we're going to think a little bit more about him just in these last few minutes. He's called in verse 1 and 2. He's called, if you look down there, he's called the Word. Words are how we reveal ourselves to people. They are our self-expression. And so if you want to get to know somebody, they need to not only come out, like the Queen from Buckingham Palace, but they need to speak. Words are our self-expression. And so this person called the Word is somehow the self-expression of God. When we meet him, we're discovering finally who God is and what he's like. Or he's called the Word, but he's also described as the light several times. So verse 4, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness. Now, when did that happen? Well, partly the answer is in creation. If you read in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the light shined in the darkness. This is the same God, the same Word, the same person who was there in the beginning, who brought light from darkness. But actually, he's also brought us light at another point in time. Look down to verse 9. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. The same one who said, "Let there be light," then broke into his own world as the light of the world. And it was Jesus who said, "I am the light of the world." We call it the incarnation. It literally means God taking on flesh and blood. We're coming on to it, but that's what verse 14 tells us. The Word, that is Jesus, took on flesh and blood. Remember, we're groping around in the darkness by nature with no understanding of who we are, of this life, of whether there's a God and what he's like. Where can I find any light? John's answer is only in seeing the God-man, Jesus, when he stepped into the world that he's made. So verse 14, the Word, again, the Word became flesh. He took on skin and bone. He became a man. Not that he appeared to be human, he really did take on flesh. He had fingerprints, he had a blood type, he would eat and sleep. He was a real person, he took on humanity. And so verse 9, back to verse 9, the true light that gives light to every man, that the true or the full light that gives light, that throws the light on all those questions, was coming into the world. We do get glimpses, don't we, of light. We're not completely in the darkness. We have some sense in us that there must be more than just this world. And as we look out at creation, we can see something of design in creation. And in the Old Testament, the part of the Bible before Jesus took on flesh, God did begin to reveal himself. So no one has ever seen God, but people did get glimpses of God. But they were really shadowy glimpses. One verse in the Old Testament says that somebody saw the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. You can't get much more of a shadowy description. They didn't see God himself fully revealed. They saw the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. It's several steps removed. No one has really and fully seen God. But in the incarnation, as Jesus takes on flesh and blood and gives us full light, suddenly it's God stepping out of the shadows and saying, here I am. The guessing can stop. This is what I'm like. And that's seen nowhere else. We can never get that understanding, that light, in any other place. And that's why I'd say to you, if you're interested in coming to the other Thursdays, if you can, do get a copy of John's Gospel. We've been reading the NIV translation. It's a good one. And just to read through John's Gospel before Thursday, if you're able to, and just have a think for yourself. What am I discovering about this God-man? What can I find out? I just want to finish. The last thing is, how can I be sure? It may be that you're new to this and you don't agree with anything I've said. It's just not something you've thought of or really believed in before. And so, as I've been speaking, you've been thinking, well, that's fine, but how can I be sure about this? But this is something that happened in real history, that God stepped into his own world and took on flesh and blood, fingerprints, a body, who could be seen and spoken to and touched, and gotten to know. And so John, who writes this, who was one of Jesus' friends, talks about people witnessing and seeing him and being with him. So look at verse 7. This is actually talking about a different John, a guy called John the Baptist, confusingly. But John, mentioned in verse 6, well, in verse 7, John the Baptist came as a witness to testify concerning that light. He met Jesus and he went on oath about him. But John himself, who writes this gospel, says in verse 14, we have seen him. John was one of Jesus' closest three friends for several years, who witnessed all that he did through this gospel, his life, his miracles, his death, his resurrection as he returned to life again through the power of his Father. John was an eyewitness to all this, and he's written it down for us. We'll think a little bit more about that on Thursday. But just to end, that means that all other philosophy is just speculation, it's just dreams, it's just guessing. But John says God has stepped out of the shadows and made himself known. All the guessing can stop. So we'd love to see you on Thursday. We'd love to think about this a bit more with you. As I said on the first week, we're not expecting anyone to have particular views, to agree with what we're saying. Anyone, whatever they think, can just come along and have a look together and just have a think about these eyewitness claims, whether they are things that we can believe. What are we finding out about Jesus? No question too hostile. You can just come and ask whatever you like and say whatever you like. But we don't want to ignore something, a claim that's so important, that's so big. The claims in this book of John are to do with life and death and heaven and hell, and we can't afford to just leave them on the shelf. We need to think about them. So come along on Thursday and have a think a bit more with us. Hope to see you there.